Today's episode has been brought to you by Schedulicity.
And today's episode is also brought to you by pelvic health professionals. In a very recent guest expert call with Caroline Van Dyken, we learned all about pelvic floor engagement, also known as Mula Bandha in the yoga world or Kegels in the medical world. We learned how and when to cue pelvic floor engagement, along with ways to strengthen and maintain that strength that you've just built in the pelvic floor. Every single yoga student that is coming to class with you has a pelvic floor and a pelvis. This is nothing to do with gender. It's nothing to do with age or childbirth. This is literally every single yoga student that's walking into class with you. So if you want to be connected with worldwide pelvic health experts and learn the most up-to-date information, make sure to check out pelvichealthprofessionals.com. And because you are a podcast listener, we have a gift for you. Use the coupon code CONNECTED2021 and get a month of free access so you can access every single thing, including this call with Caroline Van Dyken in the library that's valid until the end of 2021. Again, the coupon code is CONNECTED2021. And the website is pelvichealthprofessionals.com. Hello and welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher Podcast. I'm your host, Shannon Crow. I use she, her pronouns. I am a Canadian who is doing a lot of learning these days about what it means to live on Indigenous land. So I'm here on Anishinaabeg, Odawa, and Mississauga land, especially when all of my ancestors came here as immigrants from Ireland, England, Scotland, and Germany. And a random fact about me, speaking of where I live now and where I used to live, I grew up in a very rich touristy town, Bayfield, Ontario. And I want to tell you that a memory came back recently. My daughter and I were going to go and check out this place, and she said, "I think it's too fancy." And all of a sudden, I was brought back to growing up in a town that, like I said, was very ritzy, rich, touristy, very high-end. Like the restaurants there were never restaurants that my parents would frequent. But I ended up working at different restaurants in that town as well. And I feel like one lesson really stuck with me, and that is to not let that define where you can or cannot go. I loved the exploring that we got to do. Bayfield is a beautiful place. We lived outside of town in a maple forest in a house that my dad and my grandpa built, and just surrounded by places to explore. And when it came to going into town and exploring, I'm sure like the kids who had just been down at the beach, we maybe had our sandals on, we maybe didn't, I don't know. We shopped at the same stores and went to the same restaurants, if we could afford it, where some of the really rich people would go. And it taught me how to just really embrace going into places like that, even if there were odd looks. You know what? We're all here on this planet, and we should have equal opportunities to go and explore and do the same things. I'm curious where you grew up and what the culture was like in that location and what memories come back to you. I'm also a mom of 3, a yoga teacher, podcaster, and founder of Pelvic Health Professionals. And this podcast was created for you so that each and every week you can feel connected and supported by information, guest experts, ideas, so that you do not feel alone, because I know what it's like as you're building your yoga business and thinking of all of the details that go into that. And speaking of details, this is part 2 in a series, and I really want to dig into some details around some questions today. So think for a moment, what would you like to let go of next year or next month or next quarter? What is no longer serving you? What patterns, thoughts, relationships, outcomes, emotions, expectations, possessions, ideas, or situations would you like to let go of so that you can make space for things that really matter to you and make space for the work that you're here to do? Now, before you go and give away all of your possessions on eBay and move to a cave to meditate in the mountains, let me first just go through this process and explain what I'm talking about. This is my own experience and something that I do every single year. And I've had multiple people over the years say to me, how do you fit everything in, Shannon? How do you, do all the social media posts you do or get the podcasts out every week? And I want to tell you that this is really the framework. And I just thought this year, you know what? Instead of doing like a webinar or a workshop, I just want to bring it onto the podcast for all of you so that you can try this out. This is a framework that I follow, and it helps me to reflect on the previous year and really focus in and plan for the next year. But like I said last week on the podcast, and I shared this in part 1, this is really yours. You can take it, try it on, see what fits, what doesn't, really make it yours. Now, last week, I talked about how I look back and see, okay, what went well this year? So go back and check that out for sure. And I also shared how I tried something new this year. I weaved in kind of the philosophy of yoga, specifically a Santosha meditation or practice or awareness. And I am just thrilled with how this felt and what my outcome was, what the list looked like. And today in part 2, I'm sharing the part of the framework where I look at what didn't work. And I really encourage you, make sure to download the PDF that goes along with this so that you'll have the framework there and you don't always have to then come back and listen to the podcast. I mean, you can. It's here for you anytime you need a refresh on this. But the PDF will really guide you through the basics of this. And in that, remember, again, make it your own. You can do this all at once if you want. If you are all the way at the end of this mini-series, you could decide, okay, now I've listened to the whole series of these and now I'm going to do it. You could do it all at once, or you can spread it out. The entire thing is here for you, especially when you feel like you're spinning your wheels and not getting where you want to go, or you're not getting there the way you would like to. And this is life or business. This is everything. Now, this year, something happened that I'm not really used to. I did not want to dig into this part of my reflect and plan framework. Now, I've examined what is happening, what is going on. I knew that I didn't get to do things that were on my plan from last year due to the pandemic and life. And, I just want to share that I procrastinated a little bit right at this step. So that's normal sometimes for that to happen. And my favorite way to procrastinate is to dig in and do research and learn. And I'm wondering, do you do this as well? I call this procrasti-working. I don't know where I first heard it, but I really like that term. So for example, if you do this, you might sit down to plan out your yoga class, and then all of a sudden you spend 2 hours researching the anatomy and biomechanics of the knee joint and how it moves in different poses like triangle or squat. And then all of a sudden you look up and you realize that you don't have your class planned. You're not really ready. But you learned a lot about knees. And I just want to say that this is one thing that I'm aware of in my own personality. I do love to learn and research. And I think it's also ironic that right here in this part of the process, where the whole focus is on letting go and non-attachment, I really kind of got stuck in the weeds on this one. And some of what I learned applies to this, of course. I learned things that I could actually share with all of you, and I'm excited to share those. For example, in the yoga text, there are 2 words that I'm learning more about that relate to non-attachment and letting go. Can you guess which 2 words these are? I bet a lot of you are like me. There was only one word that I was focused on. The one that came to mind for me right away is aparigraha. So translating to non, pari, all sides, graha, to grab, seize, or grasp. But when I got doing this research, it felt like what this was really talking more about was possessions more than anything. So along the lines of only taking what we need and not being greedy or wasteful. And maybe that's the part where I started to get a little bit stuck. And if you have resources or thoughts on this, I would love to hear them in the comments over on the show notes page. So that's at theconnectedyogateacher.com/251, because as you all know, I am learning a lot along the way, and I'll always be a student of yoga and Sanskrit and philosophy of yoga. The other word was brought to my attention by my friend Jivana Heyman, who's the founder of the Accessible Yoga Conference and nonprofit group, and also the author of now 2 books. And I want to share this word that Jivana asked me to really think on right after we hear from our sponsor, Schedulicity.
Hi, Connected Yoga teachers. This is Scotty with Schedulicity and the hot tip of the week. When you have your business plan in place, Schedulicity can help you measure your success. Our detailed reports allow you to see exactly where your revenue is coming from and what services, classes, and promotions are the most popular. Analyzing your results will keep you on track and help you see what needs to be changed along the way.
Thank you so much, Schedulicity, for making the podcast possible and also for giving our Connected Yoga teachers a coupon code where they can get 2 months of free access. So that code, Connected Yoga Teachers, is in our show notes, and it's also CYT 2 months. So as I was saying, Jivana had another word that he encouraged me to look at with regards to non-attachment. I'm so curious if you are shouting it out as you listen to this podcast right now. So in his most recent book, which just came out this month, if you're listening in real time, December 2021, Jivana talks about non-attachment, and please know that I'm just learning this, so I might say it wrong. So I think it's Vairāgya. And please feel free to leave me a voice message if you have, got the pronunciation of this down. Over at theconnectedyogateacher.com on our homepage, there's a button to leave me a voice message. Also tell me, who are you? Where are you sharing yoga? And how can our listeners learn more from you? So after many voice messages back and forth with Jivana, I became aware of 2 things. I wanted to learn more about Vairāgya, the pronunciation and the meaning of this. And I also wanted to make sure that what I'm doing isn't appropriation of yoga. So I didn't want to try and take this one aspect of yoga, pick it out, and force it to fit into my framework for my own benefit. And it was really thanks to Jivana and his feedback on this where I started to consider that. I mean, I did mention it in a voice message to him to explain where I was coming from, what I was wanting to do. And I just appreciate that he's really such a good friend that he will offer, really honest feedback to me. And I explained to him that I was really wanting to see how I could bring yoga in as my own personal practice. And as I shared last week, this really made such a difference when I started to bring in Santosha. I feel like it changed it completely. And the really cool thing that came out of this discussion with Jivana is that when I asked him, hey, would you be willing to share some of this on the podcast? He said yes. So we did a kind of a mini interview. I mean, it's a nice long chunk of an interview to go with today's topic. But for Jivana and I, who I feel like we can have long conversations and the time goes really quickly, it's a shorter one. So you can listen in and I'll share that after I walk you through the steps of how I do this framework so that you can do it yourself. Now, I think this is really an important part of reflecting. It's where we get to look at what is distracting me, what is pulling me off course, and where am I really bumping into the wall of like unnecessary suffering. And all of these things can really hold you back from the important work that you're here to do. And also from just digging in and enjoying life to the absolute fullest. Now, I have one very hard rule for myself when I make this list. I've learned this through the years. I try and make this list of what do I want to let go of half as long as my list from part 1, that Santosha contentment reflection list of what went well. I challenge myself to think of at least double the things that went well in the previous year, because my mind loves to gravitate over to and highlight what didn't go well. I don't know if you're the same way. You can definitely change that up for yourself. And as I was doing my research, something popped out at me along these lines in Jivana's book, Yoga Revolution. On page 22, he says, "Be kind to yourself. Have compassion for yourself. Try not to use these teachings in a way to condemn yourself." And that really stuck with me, especially in this part. Jivana's book is absolutely amazing. His and the book that I've recently talked about on the podcast as well by Jacoby Ballard are going to probably be on my reading table for a while. It feels like they're so supportive as I look at how can I integrate yoga into my life, and how can I also, for me, show up in the work of social justice and have this be part of my yoga practice off the mat. Ooh, and this is a really great time to tell you as well that we're giving one of Jivana's books away. So if you want to win one of his books, the way to enter is to head on over to our show notes page, theconnectedyogateacher.com/251. And as you're listening to today's podcast at any point, share your thoughts or your questions down in the comments at the bottom of the page. And then we're going to draw a winner and send a book out to one of you. So as I was saying, Jivana's book is so good for so many reasons. And one thing that really landed for me is how he was talking about Vairāgya is about looking at what we want to reach for or make space for. So take a moment right now and tighten your fists if you can in this moment. Maybe this isn't a good idea if you're driving, but tighten your hands into fists and notice what it's like to grip and hold on. There is no room in your hands to receive when you're holding your hands really tight like this. Now let go and open your hands and notice the space that you've created and how the tension is different. And with compassion for yourself. So remember that compassion piece. Because wow, this has been quite a year that we've all been through, or maybe you're looking at the last month or the last quarter. Let's begin to think of what you could let go of to create space. So find a pen and paper. I have a few more notes here, but I really want you to get comfortable. So you might want to grab a journal, a really nice pen. You might want a tea, but don't overcomplicate this. And at the top of the page, you might write down things I would like to clear out and let go of, or release and create space. And just remember that we're aiming for, if you want to try this, half as many as you did in part 1. So we'll number them as well, but we're going to look at doing half as many as part 1. And we're doing this with compassion. These things on the list are not what is quote unquote wrong with you. They're things that you're ready to release and let go of. They're not actually parts of you. And a few more important notes here. In this, we are not looking at how to escape every moment of discomfort or bad emotion. So remember, it is totally normal to feel all the emotions, sad, angry, disappointed, embarrassed, or stressed at some point in our life. And ignoring these emotions, the ones that are more uncomfortable, and ignoring what's happening in the world isn't the answer. So, for example, listening to the news might be stressful for you. So you might really want to choose how you stay connected with what's happening in the world while also caring for yourself. And there might be times where you think, you know what, I can't listen to the news. I can't tune in around what's happening. I really have to go in, support myself, and then look at how I can show up and serve the world. Also, it's okay to have a sense of identity, to have nice things around you, and to have goals. Sometimes when we think of this letting go or aparigraha yama, I think we might try and oversimplify it to mean that we need to give away all of our things, not make any plans at all, and just be, and not identify with any, identities that we hold. For example, I said at the beginning of the podcast, I'm a mom of 3. That's an identity that I'm very happy to be in. One thing that might be helpful is to think of a person, a mentor, a teacher, someone who you look up to in a way. I hesitate to say that, but you really admire what they're doing. And my guess is that anyone that you think of that would land on this list is focused on their important work that they're doing. And they're showing up. They're brave, they're courageous, they're speaking up, and they are not detached and avoiding. So I think it's really important that we as yoga teachers know that this means that we're going to show up and do our accounting, pay our taxes, do things that we might want to not be doing, like marketing or, think of the things that running a business, those things that we might want to avoid. We are showing up still to do that. Also, that we're standing up for individuals who are not given basic human rights. I feel like that's not just as yoga teachers, that's humans walking this planet. So we're looking at the yamas and niyamas for sure in this, like bringing these parts of yoga philosophy. How can we care for ourselves and care for others? Another thing that we're doing as yoga teachers is this continuation of learning. So at some point, and I did a whole podcast on this, episode 247, not that long ago. A lot of you have told me how much this helped you. At some point, as a yoga teacher, we all are wrong because we're continuing to learn, and being wrong is part of learning. So if you're like, wait a second, I don't want to show up and be wrong as a yoga teacher, go back and have a listen to episode 247 where I share some very personal, vulnerable moments where I have been wrong as a yoga teacher, and I hopefully am doing the work to learn more and grow and improve. I also want to clarify that some things you might want to put on this list, it just might not be possible now or ever to get rid of these things. But you can still put them on the list. Just be mindful and think about it. So a really great example is every single year, I put email on that list because I really dislike how distracted I get from email and how annoyed I feel when I just read spammy junk emails. But the truth is that I love connecting to listeners, podcast listeners. So I don't want to get rid of all emails, just the annoying ones. If anyone has ideas on that, I add it to the list so that my brain knows, okay, how could you pass over some email tasks, or how could you filter things out? It's there, it's on the list. I think I have one more note here. This whole framework, what we're doing is like your map and your compass all wrapped into one. So imagine that we're going on a road trip together and the road that we're taking is really smooth and easy to travel on. And we come into this area of mountains. You get to choose. Is this a mountain you want to climb? Or are you staying on the road? Because remember, the road is smooth and easy and it's taking us to where we wanted to go. Now, there's no right or wrong answer here. It's not like we always have to pick. Here's an example. Recently, I was driving and I'd just gone through a busy intersection in our neighborhood, and there was a very small dog on the road. So in that moment, I know what I'm doing because this quote-unquote mountain has come up before in my life. I put on my four-way flashers so that other people are like, oh, what's she doing? I pull over and I help the dog. Now, it was a lot easier because by the time I had pulled over, a local neighbor also stopped to help the dog. And right away, because both of us had stopped on different parts of the road, we were able to make sure that that dog got back to his family safely. And I later learned that he's an old, blind, deaf dog, and he just kind of wandered off and got onto the road. So it's maybe not even a mountain, maybe it's a small hill, but it's not one that I drive by, right? Personally, I know that I'm going to stop and help animals if they're on the road. So that's dogs, turtles, skunks, snakes. I slow down. I decide, am I going to help them in some way or am I going to call for help? And I use this story because I know what I'm doing in that moment. I know that this is one of those things that I'm literally stopping on the road and not going on my merry way on this smooth road ahead. But we all need to choose, and sometimes it's a brand new thing that comes up and we've never dealt with it before and we don't know. Is this a mountain that I decide, okay, I'm going to blast through it or climb it, metaphorically, of course. And remember that if we decide, okay, this is a mountain I want to climb, if we climb every single mountain alone, we would never get anywhere. We would be so exhausted, so worn out. So it's important to look for, where is my community? So that really helps. And it's also very important, which mountains do you want to climb and tackle? And this whole thing today is all about letting go of everything else. But there will be things where you're like, no, this is definitely, I stopped to do this. So I'm still learning this. I've tackled some mountains that just really aren't mine to climb. I've tackled some mountains that are distractions on the road, or I have not asked for enough help before deciding I'm going to climb this mountain. So that's an analogy that I hope is helpful as you think about this as well. And I have a short list of questions here for you. As you make your list, you can pause this podcast at any time and just really focus in and do your list. And then after I read these questions, I'm going to be back here with Jivana to close out this episode with more to think on. Okay, so here are some journal prompts. Use whatever ones help. What habits or patterns would you like to let go of? What feels out of alignment? What's pulling you off course? What would you clear out if it meant that you could make space for more things that you enjoy or for the work that is important to you? What distractions can you eliminate or minimize? What are you fighting that is draining you? What is feeling like unnecessary struggle or resistance? Is there a project or yoga class or task that you can release? What relationships feel out of balance right now? What emotions are holding you back? Where are you grasping or holding on tightly? When are your days off? Are you putting unrealistic expectations on yourself? Do you have space, enough space on your calendar? What path is easier and what mountains are not yours? So, connected yoga teachers, you can replay that list if you want to. You can pause the podcast now to really focus in on your list if you'd rather have silence. And then I'm going to be back here, like I said, with Jivana. Okay, if you're still listening, you've either finished your list or you just want to hear the conversation or you're on the go or you're just a rebel and you're like, I'm not pausing. I'm here for all of it. So I'm glad you're still here. Let's get right into the conversation with Jivana. So Jivana has been here on the podcast before talking about accessible yoga and moving a teacher training online. And I'll link to both of those in the show notes so you can have a listen and hear more of an introduction or hear more from Jivana as well if you'd like to. Let's dive right in and hear Jivana's thoughts on this. Hey, Jivana, welcome to the Connected Yoga Teacher podcast. I'm so glad that you were up for this chat here today.
Yay. Hey, Shannon. It's so good to see you. I love talking to you anytime.
How are you feeling as your book is just about ready to launch, your second book?
I feel good. I can't quite explain it, but I enjoy the process more, of actually writing. And this is harder. I mean, I love talking about it. And so hopefully we'll get to talk about it today, but I'm into the creative process. So I'm already thinking about my next book, to be honest. So.
You're like, let's get this promotion and marketing over with so I can get back to writing.
Exactly. No, but I mean, this is an opportunity to teach and I love to teach. So yeah, let's get to it. What are we talking about?
Okay, so I just want to catch our listeners up that I reached out to you last week, I think it was, before the weekend, because I was doing my end of year reflection and planning going forward into the next year. Because I, maybe to a fault, love planning. Like my mom used to say, quit making the list, just do something on the list. So it's a pattern of mine in my life. And part of that was I reached out to you and was asking you about non-attachment and saying, would it be okay for me to bring this into what I'm doing, where I kind of look at what I'd like to let go of at the end of a year? Gosh, these things really didn't serve me. How could I clear those things off my plate? Or, try and stop doing these patterns that don't work for me. And that got us into two discussions, one around two words that could equal non-attachment, and the other discussion, how to respectfully use yoga within what we're already doing. So why don't we start there? What if we want to, obviously I don't want to say, I created this and now I'm going to make yoga fit my creation. But what happened, the magic that happened, I feel like, is that when I started to bring the philosophy of yoga into it, I felt much more connected to it. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I love that question. I love it. And that is really what my new book is about. So I do hope people will get the book and read it, Yoga Revolution, because what I really tried to address was that tension between the traditional teachings and how we can approach them in a respectful way. And because we always talk about these days, we're not just practicing asana, we're practicing all 8 limbs. And actually, yoga is even more than 8 limbs. I'll just say that right away. To me, when you say all 8 limbs, that's still limiting. Yoga is so much more. But how do we do that in a way that is not appropriating the culture, but in a way that's respectful? And so what I try to share in the book is just my personal journey with that, which is to apply the teachings in my life, which is what I think you're asking about. But I think I would just stop and say, where I kind of a warning goes off for me is that these are spiritual teachings. And I think that's the key, is that we need to get back to the heart of it. And it's hard to take apart just one piece without looking at the whole. And what is the purpose? The purpose of yoga is for spiritual enlightenment. And the Yoga Sutras in particular, which is where both concepts you're talking about of Vairāgya and aparigraha both come from the sutras, which really were written for monks thousands of years ago, that there has to be some kind of translation and a way to adapt it to our lives today. But first, I always ask, like, how can we apply monastic ancient teachings to our lives now? And that's a question, really. How do we do that in a respectful way? I actually think the Bhagavad Gita is more aligned with householder path, and we tend to not look to the Gita as often in the West as the sutras, and yet the Gita is more about engaged yoga as, yoga as service, looking at what is your path, what is your practice now in life. As a householder who has a role, it's not so much about leaving society and going off the way that Patanjali's sutras are really for someone who is like leaving the world, wanting to go and meditate and distance themselves from relationships. But I do think we can do some interpretation. I think the concept of non-attachment is central to the themes in both the Gita and the sutras. It's a central idea in the concept of yoga. And I'll just say that to me, when I say go back to the meaning, what is it for? It's about spiritual enlightenment. And that means the realization that we are spiritual beings. And that the Gita says it very clearly, right in the beginning, that our spirit is immortal. That's the part of us that's never changing. And it's the mind and body that are always changing. And the goal, I'd say, of the Gita in particular is to show us that we have misidentified with the body-mind rather than with spirit. And if you come at it that way, looking at, and the fact is that we are spirit, it's nothing we have to get or do.
Right.
That's who we are.
Right.
And so you could think of the teachings of yoga as more reconnecting or remembering that truth. Non-attachment to me is about seeing clearly what it is we think we need from outside of ourselves to be happy. So attachments are things in the world that we think we need, that are outside of ourselves, that we need to be happy, when yoga teaches us actually happiness arises from within us, from connecting to spirit. That's our true nature. Connecting there is how happiness is found, not from getting something or achieving something. So I always say yoga is like the opposite of capitalism in a way, because in capitalism, we're being trained that we have to perform and achieve and make money, get power, look a certain way, whatever it is, yoga is the opposite. Yoga is saying, turn inward. Don't worry about all that. This is where peace is found. Once you've found that, then you can go out in the world and serve. So it's a different model. And I guess that's why sometimes it's hard to apply the yoga teachings to a Western model without really looking at what is the whole system built around.
Right. That's very helpful. And I just want to say that I think this is what happened this year. So when you're saying yoga is the opposite of capitalism, every year before this year, I usually look at what went well this past year, what didn't go well. Those are kind of the two lists. And last year I started to think, could I, in my own brain and in my own, because I'm just journaling, it's just me doing this, could I call this Santosha? And so I really thought, with a whole different mindset this year, I thought, okay, where did I find moments of Santosha, of that contentment, of just joy? And when I started my journaling and to look at the difference between last year and this year, I was very focused on achievements. And this year, it's very focused on really concrete moments of just joy and happiness
I love that.
Yeah. So then I was like, okay, I want to do this for non-attachment, but this is where I got really stuck, interestingly enough, all around non-attachment. I was getting very attached to
Well, the thing about non-attachment is it's about analyzing the craving itself, the desire.
Right.
Attachment is selfish desire, thinking that you'll get something to fill you because you feel unfulfilled. So the idea of non-attachment is saying, no, I'm already full. So it's like a double negative. Non-attachment. It's confusing that way. It sounds like it's a negative thing, right? But it's actually double negative. It's actually a positive. Non-attachment is fullness. Sometimes I just say it's pure love. It's like I have a connection that non-attachment is the fact that I have this love inside of me and I feel that with other people I'm connected with and with the rest of the world when I'm in that mindset. When I let go of what my mind thinks I need, it reminds me of like with my husband, like some days, I mean, we get along and I just feel very loving towards him. And some days it's just like, you didn't do this for me. You know what I mean? It's more like that. And so it's like trying to connect to the love that's behind it's not transactional. You know what I mean? Like,
right.
It's easier sometimes with my dog, you know, or like when my kids were babies.
Right.
That just like the love I felt for something so pure, that's a sense of it, I think, where I'm not hoping to get something back.
You talked about this in your book, and I think your book was really helpful when I was starting to work through this in my brain. What really caught me was you talked about doing the work like social justice work and not getting attached to the outcome. And I thought, oh, like I definitely think, well, if I do some social justice work, I think I do attach to an outcome. Like if we do a podcast and we talk about cultural appropriation, I'm hoping it impacts studios and teachers and that there's less cultural appropriation. And I do feel pretty attached to that outcome.
Actually, what part of that desire is a genuine love for people, wanting there to be less harm. And I think that's positive. So it's not like desiring that there to be less harm isn't an attachment, right?
Okay.
If it's something that's positive, like that based on the fact that you are love already and you want to expand that, that's not the selfish desire that we're talking about in non-attachment. And I think it's just that we're complicated beings. We're spiritual beings having this human experience. And I think to me, the practice is integrating both parts of ourselves, like you're trying to do. Like applying the teachings in your life is a great activity, so useful. And so I'm applauding you for doing that. But I just think that to get a full concept of the teachings, we have to keep the context in mind. And I also just want to say as a disclaimer that this is my interpretation. I'm very much like a student of yoga and I don't try and say I'm a scholar or anything like that. I'm sure I would recommend you speak with others. There's some incredible teachers right now, especially South Asian teachers. I was thinking about Sham Raghunathan. I actually have his book over here. Do you know Sham?
Yes, we've met at a conference and we have him coming up on the podcast.
Oh, good. Okay, this is his translation of the Yoga Sutras, which is very intriguing. And, and I owe so much to my teacher, Swami Satchidananda, who translated the sutras as well, and the Gita, and that was his passion. And so I learned a lot from him. But I do think it's on all of us, if we're yoga practitioners, to really look at how are we living the teachings off the mat? How do we understand these teachings? And can we expand our mind enough to even understand the context that they were created in? Do you know what I'm saying? It doesn't really make sense when you read those teachings. It doesn't make sense from our perspective here. We have to put our mind in a different place and think about, the sutras make a lot more sense when you realize that Patanjali was assuming, he starts with this assumption of fullness, of spirituality being our essence. Like he starts there. So then it makes sense when he talks about quieting the mind. It's in the context of the fact that you're only quieting the mind so you can be more and more sensitive to what's going on in your heart, in your spirit, in your soul.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and to also clarify, non-attachment doesn't mean, I'm going to have non-attachment to all that's going on in the world because it's too painful, like watching the news or standing up for things. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Well, that's really interesting. There's a real tension in the way that teachings are translated in that, what you just brought up, in whether or not yoga can be considered completely personal, internal practice, or if it affects the way we are in the world. And I think it's clear that, or to me, I'll just say, my interpretation is that it's both. And that's really the theme of my book, looking at how yoga is revolutionary in our inner life and also in the way we act in the world. But it starts going inward. That's where we begin. We do the work on ourselves, and then we look at our actions. That's in a way what yama niyama, you could say, is like, it's your actions. It's like, how do you live in the world? That's not really what non-attachment means. I think there's confusion about non-attachment being like detachment, like not caring. what I would say to that is it's not caring about how it affects you personally so much, but rather caring because of the love you feel for every other being at the deepest level. And that's what non-attachment's about. So I describe it as compassion. It's like non-attachment means I love you and I want good things to happen to you, but I'm not going to base my happiness on what happens to you. Example that I think is in the medical profession, you know how doctors aren't supposed to like practice with their own family, or like surgeons, you're not supposed to have surgery on your own. You would think logically, well, if I needed surgery, I would go to my partner. They would be the best because they care the most about me. But we know that's not true. That somehow that attachment from your partner would impair their ability to be good at surgery when it's on you. That's the part we're talking about. It's not like they don't care about you. It's actually the selfishness, the attachment can interfere with the way we see the world. And so going back to the word Vairāgya, it means with color or without color. Non-attachment means without color. And it kind of applies to this idea of seeing clearly. And the attachments are disturbing our vision. It distorts our vision because of the selfishness involved and what our personal attachment to that person or situation is.
That's so good. I love the example of surgery and why surgeon that brought it right home. I feel like that really helped. Because it is impaired.
Complex.
Yeah, it is complex. So you think, here's a really technical question now. Do you think I should just, I was going to do a PDF for our listeners and talk about how, I was doing this thing. I decided to bring yoga into it. I really appreciate what you're saying here, though. I want to make sure I add that in. This is my interpretation of it. This is something I'm doing. I'm just practicing. I really, yoga is so much more. We know that. But I'm wondering if I even bring the Sanskrit title onto my PDF at all, or if I just leave English words on it.
I think that it's debatable in general. I hear a lot of people saying, if you don't understand Sanskrit, we shouldn't use it. We should just let it be and focus on the English. But at the same time, many people say we should respect the tradition and learn the words, right? We should learn the Sanskrit words and actually try to understand better. So I think it's really debatable. I think you have to reflect on what works for you. What I'm saying is more focus on the context, actually. And that pulling a concept out from the yoga teachings and applying it in our kind of Western capitalist system, that feels wrong. And so all I was trying to share with you is the idea of, non-attachment or non-greed. Those concepts really exist within a full system that's designed to connect us with our spirit. That's the point. And if you just divorce it from that and connect it with your activity or your success at something, I think that's distorting the teaching a little bit. I don't mean to criticize.
I am all here for, I don't feel like you're criticizing me. I feel like you're asking me questions around it. And for someone who's grown up in a capitalist society, I think it's hard I'll just speak personally, I think it's hard for me to see these things.
Mm-hmm. And actually, the teachings can allow us to see that. That's the point, right? That's the idea. Svadhyaya or viveka is a word I really enjoy in the teachings. And the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, he talks clearly about, for example, how the 8 limbs of yoga, if you look at the sutra that comes right before the 8 limbs, he talks about the purpose of the 8 limbs of yoga is to give us clear vision, viveka, to be able to discriminative, he called it discriminative discernment, the ability to discriminate between what is spirit and what is body, mind. What is immortal and eternal, that's our spirit, that's going to live on forever. What part of us is that? And what part of us is constantly changing, temporary, human, actually? That's the question of yoga, is what part of you is never changing and permanent, and what part of you is temporary? And as much as we don't like to think about it, this body and mind is temporary.
Yes.
We're going to die. Sorry.
Sorry, you heard it here on the podcast. Jivana's just given us some really bad news. You saying that makes me think of all of the things that are like I can have a little more of this thought process as a 45-year-old body around my body. But when you say that about my mind, I'm like, it's very hard for me to think of spirit and mind. Like they seem very attached to me.
Very attached? You mean they seem like connected to each other?
Yeah.
Spirit and mind. Yeah. Well, I mean, that's fine. I actually would say there's different approaches to this that gets complicated. You could look at non-duality or duality and all that. But I would say they aren't really separate. Like on one level, it's true that the mind and the body are an expression of the spirit. So on the one level, they are completely connected. But that's not really what yoga is saying. Yoga is dual philosophy, saying that there's separation, and we're trying to see that clearly. And that's really what the Yoga Sutras are all about. It's all about discerning what is mind and what is spirit. That's the point of almost all the teachings in the sutras. And I think it's effective. I think it's an effective philosophy. It's not about denying the reality of the body-mind. Like it's not saying it doesn't exist right now. That's true. But it is going to die. And I think in the West, we tend to identify with the mind so much that we don't even know what it means to identify with spirit.
Right. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I'm not sure even how to do that.
Right. I like to use the word heart. Sometimes instead of saying God or divine or spirit or consciousness, I think heart works for me. Because I know you're a very loving, caring person, and I think you could identify with that part of yourself. So can you distinguish between what is mind in terms of kind of ego thinking mind, that level, and then what is heart?
Okay, that's helpful. Because spirit feels very like I can't.
Okay, well let's say heart then, or whatever word you'd like. But that's the true you that is never changing, according to yoga, that will live forever.
Right. I want to say that I really appreciate that I could message you and you were like, that's in my book. And then I went to read the book and then I was like, okay, wait, I have more questions now. Not very often can I do that. Like not very often do I know an author where I'm like, okay, Jivana, I just want to leave you 25 Instagram voicemails.
Love your voicemails. Anyway, I hope it was helpful. I think the point is that non-attachment helps us to have that vision of what part of us is unchanging and eternal. And I think that's what spirituality really is about. It's trying to identify and connect with that part of ourselves. And I think non-attachment is the ability to do that. It's kind of like letting go of everything else that's not authentically you. That's not your permanent self. Anyway, well, thanks for having me on. I could talk forever about this, but I will stop. And I hope people read the book. I just want to say, keep studying. What's great about yoga is you can read the teachings directly. Go read the Yoga Sutras. Go read the Bhagavad Gita yourself. It's right there for us. We can read hundreds of translations of them. That's powerful to go back to the source.
It is. It is. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your book. I'm excited about your next book as well because you gave me some indication of what it's about. I'm really excited about that. And yeah, just thank you for your time, for digging through this, and also for being enough of a friend to say, just press pause here for a moment and look at your intention and how's that sitting. Yeah, that means a lot.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for talking to me and for all your amazing work. Everyone's very appreciative of you. This whole Connected Yoga Teachers group is just so lucky to have you. Really, you're like this very peaceful guide, You're like the mom we all wanted.
Talk to my kids about that. Thank you, Jivana.
Thank you. All right, bye.
Thank you so much, Jivana. Oh my goodness. I really appreciate your thoughts and your friendship and this amazing book that you've written. Thank you also, Connected Yoga teachers, for hanging out right until the end of the podcast here today. Remember that there are 2 gifts. Well, there's actually 3 gifts in today's podcast episode. So Schedulicity shared a coupon code with us. There's also a draw to win Jivana's latest book. If you comment on our show notes page at theconnectedyogateacher.com/251, and you can find every gift and link and note over there as well. And if you would like to get a month of access to pelvic health professionals up until the end of this month, December 2021, use the coupon code CONNECTED2021 over at pelvichealthprofessionals.com. And again, it's all in the show notes. If you're on the go, we take the notes for you. Alrighty, it's time for me to sign off. I will be back next week with part 3, where we really dig into a list that I created just this year that I added to this process. It's an optional list that you can make. It's when I got really frustrated with something. And also, I'm going to be sharing the 4 areas of importance outline. This is something that I get asked about all the time. It really helps going forward and with that planning, and really helps with that focus. I also want to say, if you are celebrating at this time of the year, happy holidays, maybe Merry Christmas to some of you. I will be spending this week eating pumpkin pie, eating all the good food, doing puzzles, hanging out with Sean and the kids, and just really relaxing and resting. If you want, you can see my updates on Instagram. That's where I'll be posting. And if you're a member of the Connected Yoga Teacher Facebook group, you will already know that our team is off for a couple of weeks on holidays. So there's no new posts happening in the group. So it's a great time for you to join us and really take less time on Facebook if you want to. I mean, there's lots of other places to hang out on Facebook. Give yourself more time and just really dive into maybe this planning as we get ready for the new year. And just so you know, the podcast is still coming out every Monday because we've worked ahead. So it's here for you. I also want to say happy holidays and a huge thank you to our entire team, Suzanne, Crunch, Sinead, Erica. Oh my gosh, thank you so much. And also, thank you, dear listener, for being here. This podcast is possible because of you. And I want to know, what will you be doing this week to stay connected to yourself, your yoga practice, and to your community so that you can share the yoga that lights you up?